The White House said today that it's looking into Labor Secretary Alex Acosta's role in securing a lenient sentence for convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. But the White House only said that it would look into it after they defended Acosta. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders saying she believed prosecutors, quote, made the best possible decision and deal they could have gotten at the time. It's a funny thing to know before you've looked into something. That best possible deal is described this way by NBC News. Quote, Epstein, 66, reached a non-prosecution deal in 2008 with the Miami U.S. Attorney, Acosta's office, to halt a federal sex abuse investigation involving dozens of teenage girls in return for him pleading guilty to state charges involving him and a single victim, paying financial settlements to other victims, and registering as a sex offender. Just yesterday, a federal judge ruled that Acosta and the other federal prosecutors on the case broke the law by not telling victims about that plea deal. Adding to the administration's troubles, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse wants answers. He's requested information about the plea deal from the Justice Department, and that adds to a growing list of possible conflicts and investigations into the executive branch from Congress. Joyce Vance is back. Joyce, this is a sickening crime, a sickening list of other alleged crimes that I guess as part of a plea deal he wasn't prosecuted for, and what seems like an inexplicable and inexcusable and a judge has said illegal violation of victims' rights by not telling the victims about this plea deal. Your analysis?
It is an absolutely horrible thought that a sitting U.S. attorney could have directed his office to give someone accused of this sort of human trafficking crime a pass. I just don't know what to say beyond that, Nicole. It's outrageous, and although we're now years fast forward, there needs to be accountability. This civil lawsuit is one mechanism for that. It's also not too late for the group inside of Justice that looks at ethics violations, OPR, to conduct an investigation. Although Acosta is no longer a DOJ employee and could not be in any way disciplined by DOJ, they could turn their findings over to Florida's Bar Disciplinary Committee. And that disciplinary committee could take action against Acosta, including stripping him of his license to practice law. That doesn't sound like a very serious penalty for what he's done or what he's alleged to have done in this opinion, but it would be, I think, a very good starting place. The White House needs to consider whether he belongs at the Department of Labor, a cabinet-level agency which, by the way, conducts a lot of anti-human trafficking operations. The irony that this man is now in charge of that work is, I just think, overwhelming.
That was the point I was going to make. Let me just, because I think Joyce makes a really important point about sort of the limits of what can be done. From the Miami Herald reporting, and the other reporting has been amazing, Acosta was the Miami-based U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida on the case, a fact that came to light during his confirmation hearing but was ignored by Republicans fast-tracking his nomination. His nomination for a massive agency with oversight over child labor laws and human trafficking makes it more egregious that he was approved.
Yeah,
Gene?
I mean, the whole thing is outrageous. The judge, of course, made this decision yesterday that it was illegal. Apparently, the record shows that a great effort was made to keep the victims from learning about this deal. It's not that they just didn't tell them, it's that they hid it from them. And Mike, I actually have a question for Joyce, which is there any way that this plea deal, this non-prosecution deal made with Epstein on federal charges could be voided at this point?
You know, that's a tough question, but if there's clear evidence that there was fraud involved in obtaining the plea agreement, an effort could be made to break the deal. Hard to predict this far out whether there would be procedural criminal law issues that would keep that from coming to pass.
It's hard to understate how gross all of these sort of creatures are in this cabinet. I mean, you couldn't have assembled people with more sort of heinous skeletons in their closet. And if you just look at the Trump, right? I'm sorry. Did we not say that out loud? No. We just say that in breaks. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to do that.
I thought you were going. I didn't know where you were going with.
No, but I mean, you're the guy with the pants. I mean, this guy with a shady plea arrangement, which may be. I mean, there may be some DOJ regulation that made this. You know, we don't know. Sarah Sanders seems to know more than she said she knew because she was going to look into it, but then she said this was the best deal he could get. But you have to wonder when Trump goes back to his base saying, having run as the guy who was going to get the best people. So was this the best person, the guy that led Jeffrey, and the guy that was going to drain the swamp? Is this either of those things?
That's sort of one of the million-dollar questions, is whether anything like this sticks. We've seen time and time again the president says one thing and then his supporters still stick by him, even though the facts basically are lining up against everything that he said. You know, he has had a tremendous amount of troubles with his cabinet, more than we've seen really in any recent president. And part of that is that there are very few people, or significantly less people that normally would want to work for a president that wanted to work for this president, and they just didn't do any vetting. And you know, there was just everything was rushed. There was not a real process. They didn't really look at the candidates who they were picking and choosing, and the president was also picking a lot of them based on how they looked and whether they, you know, if he had chemistry with them or what, all these other sort of arbitrary reasons. And so he wound up with a cabinet that at this stage, you know, is a lot of it is acting, frankly.
The fact that Republicans fast-tracked this nomination speaks volumes. And because of that, I think that accountability, and I appreciate Ben Sasse saying what he's saying and pushing the way he's pushing, because this rests ultimately with those who advised and consented. And I think that this speaks again to earlier conversation about how this party and how the players in it really just outperform themselves when it comes to just going to the race to the bottom. It's just amazing to me.
Real quick.
Sounds like short term he's going to survive this based on what Trump said. But let's remember that there's a huge trove of emails. Allegedly, this went over a span of years that they were trying to conceal this and quiet these victims. And secondly, to Joyce's point, there's no statute of limitations on sex trafficking. And this web could be huge. There's a question as to why this was concealed for so long. There's other players, other big names that are about to come out.
Welcome back to Up. I'm David Gura. There are calls this morning for another member of President Trump's cabinet to resign. Alexander Acosta, a former U.S. attorney who is now the Secretary of Labor. At issue is a non-prosecution deal for Jeffrey Epstein, a multimillionaire financier charged with sexually abusing more than 30 teenage girls over 10 years. Alexander Acosta oversaw that deal, and a Florida judge has just ruled prosecutors broke the law by concealing a plea agreement from the victims. At the White House, the president was pressed on that matter yesterday.
Mr. President, do you have any concerns about the Labor Secretary's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case?
I really don't know too much about it. I know he's done a great job as Labor Secretary, and that seems like a long time ago, but I know he's been a fantastic Labor Secretary.
So there's the president addressing this. I want to play one more bit of tape here. This is Secretary Acosta himself during his confirmation hearings. This was something he was asked about time and time again. Let's listen to what he had to say in response to those questions about his involvement in this case.
This matter was originally a state case. It was presented by the state attorney to the grand jury in Palm Beach County. The grand jury in Palm Beach County recommended a single count of solicitation not involving minors, I believe, and that would have resulted in 0 jail time, 0 registration as a sexual offender.
Glenn Kirshner, one reads the 3-part series in the Miami Herald about all of this with a growing sense of nausea. It is a disgusting, reprehensible thing that happened in Florida. Walk us through what happened here this week, all of this centering on the Federal Crime Victim Rights Act. How does it play into this, and what does this mean for Jeffrey Epstein? What does it mean also for the Secretary of Labor who oversaw this?
So, David, back in 2004, the Crime Victims' Rights Act, the CVRA as we called it, was enacted into law. It gave victims unprecedented rights in the criminal justice system, which we all, I think, I'm not going to lie, we were a little bit fearful of it at first, because it used to be there was the prosecutor and the defense attorney, and those were the two people who had rights, so to speak, in the criminal litigation. Now, as of October of 2004, victims had rights, and they had dramatic rights. For example, and this is how the Acosta-Epstein thing comes into play, as part of the victim's Bill of Rights in the CVRA, a victim can actually object to a plea offer that the prosecutor extends to the defense attorney. And the victim can go into court and say, Judge, I don't like this. I don't feel like my rights are being protected and vindicated.
That's what's supposed to happen.
That's what's supposed to happen. And guess what? If the judge accepts that plea offer over the victim's objection, the victim can appeal that decision. So we had to implement this in 2004. We had to train our prosecutors to make sure you protect every single right the CVRA grants to victims. Now we have Acosta apparently in what looks like these ugly backroom deals between Acosta as the U.S. attorney in Florida at the time and Epstein's lawyers to not only cover up the horrific crimes that Epstein had committed. I mean, sex trafficking, underage girls. I mean, these are some of the most vulnerable victims in our country. But they lied to Acosta lied to the victims about it. Don't worry, there will be a federal prosecution. We're going to vindicate your rights, and then he never did. So here, I think, is the important endgame to what is going on right now. The Crime Victims' Rights Act is not a criminal statute, so Acosta can't be prosecuted for violating it. He can be disbarred. He should certainly be fired as the Secretary of Labor, or he should resign. OPR, the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility, has opened an investigation, and it's a crack outfit, I can tell you, into what Acosta did back then. But here's one thing that I have been thinking about. How can Acosta be held accountable in the most dramatic way? Well, you know what? If he conspired with Epstein's lawyers to basically pull the wool over the victim's eyes, the Crime Victims' Rights Act might not be a criminal statute, but conspiring to violate it is a criminal offense. And I can only hope that this thing is fully investigated. And if criminal jurisdiction is in the mix somehow, I hope Acosta is held accountable, because this is reprehensible.
Well, and David, I think we also just have to remember, none of these things are isolated incidents, right? So the Acosta-Epstein situation, Bob Kraft, and if it is indeed sex trafficking and not just sex work, Bob Kraft and 100 other men who were involved in this in Florida, and also R. Kelly, right? We are seeing capitalism and patriarchy come and collide in a way in our nation where these are things that women have been talking about for decades. And we're seeing some of the men in the highest offices of power abusing that in a way. And we know that the president somehow is constantly attached to these types of men. And this is also part of the problem.
He's also abusing the topic because he
very quickly, I want to get to that. Let's play a bit. We played a bit of clip there from President Trump at the Oval Office yesterday. He was asked about Bob Kraft, his friend, longtime friend, in that Oval Office availability yesterday as well. Let's take a listen to what the president had to say about that.
What about the charges against Bob Kraft? He's a friend of yours.
Well, it's very sad. I was very surprised to see it. He's proclaimed his innocence totally, but I'm very surprised to see it.
Philippe, he's proclaimed his innocence totally. This is a recurring theme now when you listen to the president.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, he goes from I don't know anything about the topic to whatever. All he does is watch TV all day, so I don't know why he doesn't know about these things. But he's also, you know, if he's not saying he doesn't know, he's saying he's talking about sex trafficking with women with blue tape, with duct tape over their mouths, and that's why we need a $25 billion border. There's a total disconnect between tolerating someone in your cabinet who played a role in this and saying that it's the biggest national security threat. It is an incredibly serious issue. Acosta should not be a cabinet member. He should probably be a lot worse than that. But it's going to be a slow motion car wreck. It's going to be another Ryan Zinke. It's going to be another Tom Price, where this goes on for 5-6 months. He should be gone before this show is over.
Yeah, and can I just say one quick thing? Yeah. President Trump, it's remarkable who he will give the benefit of the doubt to and who he won't. He said something very similar about Vladimir Putin to that. He said he didn't do it.
There you go.
It took just 9 hours for Donald Trump to call for retribution against Saturday Night Live after Alec Baldwin did an impression of him that he didn't like last weekend. But it's been 2 days since the public first learned about a domestic terror plot, arguably the biggest threat against both politicians and journalists this country's ever seen. And Donald Trump is just now getting around to responding. Had authorities not caught 49-year-old Coast Guard Lieutenant Christopher Hassan in time, he might have carried out an unprecedented act of domestic terror. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the president has been tweeting about since the announcement of his arrest. Faster internet, a replacement wall, Jussie Smollett, fake news, the Russia investigation, and not a single word about a white nationalist who'd stockpiled 15 guns, 1,000 rounds of ammo, steroids, and a list of at least 22 names. And until this afternoon, crickets from the president. Here's what he finally said last hour.
When were you briefed, sir, on the Coast Guard member who was arrested for threatening Democrats and other members of the media?
I'm actually getting a very final briefing and a very complete briefing in about 2 hours.
And do you have any thoughts on this man?
I think it's a
who
shame.
went after members of the media?
Yeah, I think it's a very sad thing when a thing like that happens, and I've expressed that, but I'm actually getting a very complete briefing in about 2 hours.
Do you think that you bear any responsibility for moderating your language when it comes to that?
No, I don't. I think my language is very nice.
Do you? Joining our conversation in Washington, NBC News national political reporter Heidi Presbella and Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson. He thinks his language is very nice. Get those sons of bitches out of here. There are good people on both sides. Yeah. Literally the same words used to describe some Democratic politicians came out of the president's mouth before they showed up on the Google search of this now arrested suspect.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, it's not, sadly, it's not the first time that at least a would-be domestic terrorist has taken cues from the president's rhetoric. I mean, the guy who shot up killed 11 people in the synagogue in Pittsburgh was reacting bizarrely to rhetoric about the southern border, which the connection is difficult to explain. It would take a half hour, but that's the connection he somehow made. I keep wondering what we would have heard from the president if Christopher Hassan's name were Enrique Morales, or if it were Mohammed al-Baghdadi or something like that. It would, you know, his thumbs would be sore from the tweeting. We would have heard, you know, just 10 minutes worth of rhetoric at that availability about the terrorist threat from the Middle East, the terrorist threat from across the border. But
it's a great point, Gene, because we heard about made-up terrorists who were swarming around the caravan. Meanwhile, you couldn't sneak around the caravan with all the drone cameras Fox News had trained on it if you wanted to. So the idea that you were going to sneak a terrorist into that caravan was ludicrous. Who has a plan, this is an actual terrorist.
An actual terrorist who has a plan and who has not a small arsenal, but a big arsenal of weapons, and is doping himself up with human growth hormone.
I thought I didn't want to sound dumb, but what are the steroids for?
I have no idea. He believes he's taking cues from the Norwegian guy Anders Breivik, remember, who killed 77 people, and apparently he dosed himself in that way with you know, opioids and human growth hormone. Somehow, I guess that makes you more homicidal.
This is where, even being a critic of Donald Trump, it doesn't feel good to see him fail these tests. It doesn't feel good to see him fail, to see him tweet about an actor who did something inane, but fail to speak out about a domestic terrorist who sought to kill journalists and politicians.
To me, that's not even the news, because we've seen this over and over, Nicole, going back really to not just Charlottesville, but back to the campaign when he really had to be nudged to disavow David Duke. But the real news here is the fact of how this came out, that it didn't come out by the Department of Justice, which by all accounts had a successful domestic terrorism investigation that apprehended someone who wanted to kill a lot of people. It was a very serious investigation, and yet it was buried. They did not want to publicize this, and it coincides with reports that show there's much more publicity when there are reports about Muslims. Islamic terrorism is apprehensions of Islamic terrorism is more promoted in press releases by the Department of Justice than these incidences of homegrown white nationalist domestic terrorists.
When the reality is exactly the opposite. Right. The real threat is from the white nationalist, white supremacist, homegrown terrorists.
How do you get a Justice Department, which seems to be, you know, it seems to be an all men and women on deck to try to keep the president and his insidious influence out of the Justice Department's goings on? How does the Justice Department answer for this?
It's a great question, and I don't know, but I thought when you look at what the president said when he finally weighed in, one of the big things that was missing was no thank you to law enforcement. There was no acknowledgement of that, which is such a simple, easy, and frankly, a very basic thing that politicians or leaders usually do in an instance like this. So that was also interesting and raises more of the questions that you're asking.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess I kind of, at this point, have reached my glass is no longer half full. It's just overflowing with all the crazy that comes out of Trump. And on this one, why would we be surprised that a self-proclaimed nationalist would not speak out against a self-proclaimed white nationalist? Why are we acting like this is a space that Donald Trump is going to go in on behalf of the American ideal? No, he's not. And these are his people. All right. And he's not going to thank law enforcement because he's probably not happy about what law enforcement did.
Is that where we are?
That's where we are. I mean, I call the space where we are. I mean, I'm just not going to try to dress it up and be all, pie in the sky and hopeful that, maybe in the next incident, Donald Trump will actually get it right, that he will have matured in his presidency enough to act like a president.
But that's a brave thing to say. Let me just draw you out on that. If he'd carried out his attacks, what do you think the president would have done?
Well, that's the next test in all of this. That's a very good question, and it's absolutely the next test, because we can sit here and honestly say we would hope that there would be the appropriate level of outrage and pushback and all hands on deck, to your point about, the Justice Department and those responding. But here we sit and we have a little question mark over, a little thought bubble is a question mark. I don't know what he would do. And that's the sad spot about all of this. And you have communities of color, you have communities across this country that are concerned about whether or not this president is interested in protecting their interests.
Let me I can't let this go because you're blowing my mind. So you think if Dylan Roof committed that crime now, I mean, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
No Amazing Grace?
Show me otherwise. Prove it to me otherwise. All right? Prove it to me otherwise, because I can only go on what you say, what you do, and what you don't do, right?
All right, let me come to you, but let me show you, I want your thoughts on this, and let's watch one of the president's allies in, I guess we call it legal circles, Joe DeGenoa.
We are in a civil war in this country. There's two standards of justice, one for Democrats, one for Republicans. The press is all Democrat, all liberal, all progressive, all left. They hate Republicans. They hate Trump. So the suggestion that there's ever going to be civil discourse in this country for the foreseeable future is over. It's not going to be. It's going to be total war. And as I say to my friends, I do two things. I vote and I buy guns.
Hey, Joe, we just hate racists. Heidi?
Well, this is, to Michael's point, the climate that we are in. And we can sit here and we can debate whether you can draw a direct line between the president's rhetoric and any one particular event. But what you can't debate is the climate that we're in right now, and the fact that just this week the president dusted off his enemy of the people rhetoric, which is authoritarian language ripped from the dictator's handbook that we have not seen from any modern American president. You have to point out the context in which these events are taking place. But then secondly, I wanted to ask Mike, go back and take one more stab at Michael, because I think one of the other things that's new
I need
here,
a drink in my cup.
I got one.
It's not just Trump, because like we say, we've seen this over and over again. But now are we to a point where no one in your party, and correct me if I'm wrong, but who in the party is speaking up? So it's not just the Department of Justice burying this, but it's the party also. Where are the party leaders who've spoken out on
this? The crickets you hear are the sounds that you get from people who aren't willing to step into this space and push back. And it goes back to what we were talking about in the first segment on all the stuff related to the investigations and the behavior of the presidency, the president, the difficulty he has placed the presidency itself in. And of course, the least important of all of this is the political piece, is the party. It's, the country first, then the party. But you would think that, that in any one of those two spaces, you would find the strength to speak out.
What party, though? What party?
Yeah.
It's not a party.
It's
a cult of personality.
It's a cult of personality.
It's an extension of the mob family. But I don't want to let this go, though, because I think we talk about the lasting harm Trump will do. It's obviously giving God knows what to Putin in terms of territory, terrain, and foreign policy giveaways. But I think the conversation on race, it's not even a conversation anymore. It's what Joe DeGenoa said it was. It's a war.
Yeah.
He greenlit a war in this country around race. And, and if you think about the most dangerous thing he's done, that might be it.
And who was talking about that? Who was actually agitating for that to happen? Donald Trump's new base. White nationalists have been agitating for that space to be exploded onto the national scene. And then when you've got credible individuals, supposedly inside the party, and Joe DeGenova, I've known him a long time, is a credible guy. When he gets out and says, we are in a state of war, well, who declared
And I'm buying guns.
And I'm buying, well, who declared this war?
But the other thing
and when do we start fighting it? Do we come to your house first? I mean, because I want to know where we start this. Because if this is the declaration that this president is allowing to be made, then we all need to do a check down on this, on guys like Joe and others. So we can't sit back silently and accept it. You know, the president had all day yesterday to speak on this issue about this terrorist that was 17 miles from the White House in Maryland, right? He had all day yesterday. His response today, 24 hours later, is, well, I've got a few hours. It's a shame, and I got some more briefing to do.
And not clear what my real quick last word.
Nice. Well, what was so remarkable about that soundbite that you played is that he talks about the Civil War, says all of these ridiculous things about what the media is, and then punctuates it with guns. And you can't read that any other way than outlining, you know, us versus them, and then violence at the end.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, and you know, there was this atmosphere. It's as if the atmosphere was sort of charged with gasoline right before, and you know, a lot of things going on, economics, race, you know, and so Trump is an arsonist. He's just lights matches.
Phil Rucker, I want to give you the last word, and I want to ask you if you can add anything to the timeline. Donald Trump said he hasn't been fully briefed. That doesn't sound right. I worked in a White House. Presidents are briefed on all terror plots, unless he's dispatched all of his White House advisors, which I didn't read about in your paper. And he said that the full briefing will be 2 hours from now. Can you fill anything into that timeline for us?
Well, he actually said 2 hours from now would be the final briefing. I cannot imagine a world in which he did not know this happened until he was just asked. And 2 points to just button this up. One, Joe DeGenova, who was just on that clip talking about war, was actually somebody Trump nearly hired as his personal attorney in the Mueller investigation. So keep that in mind. And number two, if it weren't for Hallie Jackson asking those questions, we still wouldn't have heard anything from President Trump. He did not voluntarily make this comment or condemn that action. He only said so in response to her questions. So good on Hallie for that.
Where today, Robert Mueller's prosecutors are expected to lay out the most detailed description yet of the criminal conspiracy that Paul Manafort, who's the president's former campaign chairman, engaged in. The scope of his crimes includes defrauding the U.S. government, covering up and lying about conversations with a Putin-aligned operative, tampering with witnesses, and misleading federal investigators after agreeing to cooperate. It's a breathtaking sweep of criminal conduct, one likely to result in Mr. Manafort spending the rest of his days in prison. But at the core, there remains unanswered questions. Why? And what, if anything, did Donald Trump know about it? Those answers might come in the sentencing memo from Mueller's team, which is due by midnight tonight. It's not clear how much of the document will be redacted to protect any ongoing federal investigations. But if news about Mueller being close to wrapping up is to be believed, this filing may be one of the final glimpses into the case Mueller has built. Also new today, NBC has confirmed that prosecutors in New York plan to bring state charges against Manafort, which would ensure that Manafort is held accountable for his crimes, even if the president pardons him. The New York Times explains, quote, the president has broad power to issue pardons for federal crimes, but no such authority in state cases. And while there has been no clear indication that Trump intends to pardon Manafort, the president has spoken repeatedly of his pardon power and defended his former campaign chairman on a number of occasions. The move by New York prosecutors marks just the latest proof point that the legal trouble for Trump world extends far beyond Mueller's reach. And that's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, Michael Steele, former chairman of the RNC, and NBC News national political reporter Carol Lee. Phil Rucker, let me start with you. Manafort and the criminal proceedings around Manafort have often often been a trigger for this president, for this White House. He's gone out on the North Lawn and called him brave. He's described his crimes as 10-year-old tax cases. He's really been all over the map with Manafort. Any reporting on the mood there today as this sentencing memo, which other sentencing memos like the Cohen one, for example, have really rocked this White House when they've come out?
Yeah, well, Nicolle, President Trump's inclination has been to try to defend Paul Manafort. He feels sympathetic for his former campaign chairman, especially because some of the crimes that Manafort has been charged with predate the Trump campaign. And so Trump has felt some sort of sympathy for Manafort there. But I have to tell you, at the moment, the bigger trigger for the White House and for President Trump, according to our reporting, is the anticipation for the Mueller report, as well as next week's public testimony by Michael Cohen. Now, White House officials will say publicly they're not concerned at all about Cohen's testimony, but that testimony promises to bring a lot of fireworks that could be very complicated for the president. And you can rest assured that the president is going to be paying close attention to it from 12 hours away on the time zone out in Vietnam, where he's going to be next week for that summit with Kim Jong-un.
Phil Rucker, it's a great reminder, and you've covered these foreign trips where the president's attention is anywhere but where he is. He's trying to monitor cable news coverage back at home during some of these other flashpoints. But you've just painted a pretty stunning constellation of flashpoints. Cohen, his former fixer, will be on Capitol Hill before 3 committees. I believe at least one of those open. We know how the president feels about what he possesses in terms of knowledge about Trump's conduct. He called it an attack on the nation when his offices were raided. What sort of preparations? I mean, there's never much other than sending Rudy out to Fox News primetime, but what preparations are underway to deal with next week?
Well, Nicolle, if you just look at the calendar for next week, I'm going to be on that trip, by the way, in Vietnam with Trump. And in Vietnam time, he's going to have his first day of meetings scheduled so far with Kim Jong-un on Wednesday. Wednesday night in Vietnam is going to be the morning here in Washington when Cohen is testifying. So if Trump's going to be paying attention to that Cohen testimony, he's not going to get much sleep between his first night of meetings with Kim Jong-un and the second day of meetings with Kim Jong-un on Thursday. It could be quite a split-screen moment for this president with all the revelations that Cohen could potentially be making in his open testimony.
Oh, Joyce, what could go wrong? A sleep-deprived president meeting one-on-one with no note-takers with the North Korean dictator. I hate to think about it. But, Joyce, take us through this Manafort sentencing document. And I referenced the Cohen sentencing memo because that was a watershed moment in terms of this White House's understanding of the potential legal exposure that the president had in the cases out of the Southern District of New York. Why are sentencing memos an opportunity to detail and sort of provide us, sort of the public, with more of a narrative explanation of the crimes, or in Manafort's case, the criminal conspiracy that Manafort's accused of, or now has been found guilty of?
There's a very clear legal framework. The United States Code establishes a set of factors that a judge has to consider at sentencing. And if a judge fails to consider all of those factors, the sentence can actually be overturned on appeal. So the government sentencing advocacy always explains to the judge what the available evidence is. And that can be the defendant's background. That can be the circumstances of the current offense, which is where we've often gotten broad information out of the Mueller team. It can even be information regarding crimes the defendant has not been convicted of. So there is a very broad scope to the sort of information the government can bring to play. And for all the redaction that we've seen in these memos, we've learned a great deal as the Manafort pleadings have been filed. For instance, this is how information regarding his late meetings with Kalimnik came to light. Much of our understanding of what we would call core conspiracy type allegations, this memo, even though it will certainly be heavily redacted, yet again, may actually give us additional insight, and that certainly will have the White House on edge.
Joyce, I want to ask you about something that Andy McCabe said to me earlier this week. I asked him, I've worked on 3 presidential campaigns and never had any contacts with Russians. So there's the weirdness of everyone on the Trump campaign talking to Russians and Russian-aligned actors all the time. But then there's the layer of all of them then lying about those contacts. That's what Mike Flynn did, lied about contacts with Kislyak. Jeff Sessions recused because he lied about contacts with Russians. And you go on down the line. One of Manafort's crimes was to lie about his contacts and conversations with Kilimnik, a Putin-aligned operative. Are we likely to learn how that fits into this broader picture of all of Trump's associates lying about their contacts with Russians?
You know, as you point out, you only lie about things. Criminal defendants tend to lie the most about issues that they have no innocent explanation to offer for. And we've already heard from Andrew Weissman, one of Mueller's prosecutors in the courtroom, that at least some of these conversations with Kilimnik are central to what's being prosecuted. I don't know that we'll learn more in this sentencing memo. We could. The interesting possibility, and